Been replying to the budget.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The test of a budget is how it affects the reality of people's lives all around this country. And I would submit, Mr. Speaker, that the reality...
Luke, if somebody wants to go for an early cup of tea, please do so. I'm told there's mince pies are waiting. But what I will have is the Leader of the Opposition listened to and quietly from this side in the same way I expected the other side of the House. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The reality test of this budget has to be how it affects ordinary people's lives. And I believe as the days go ahead and this budget unravels, the reality will be a lot of people will be no better off and the misery that many are in will be continuing. Pay, Mr. Speaker, is now lower than it was in 2010, and wages are now falling again. Economic growth in the first 3 quarters of this year is the lowest since 2009 and the slowest of the major economies in the G7. It's a record of failure with a forecast of more to come. Economic growth has been revised down, productivity growth has been revised down, business investment revised down, people's wages and living standards revised down. What sort of strong economy is that? What sort of fit for the future is that? You may recall, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the deficit was due to be eradicated by 2015. Then that moved to 2016, then to 2017, then 2020, and now we're looking at 2025. They're missing their major targets, but the failed and damaging policy of austerity remains. The number of people sleeping rough has doubled since 2010, and this Christmas, Mr. Deputy Speaker, 120,000 children will spend Christmas in temporary accommodation. 3 new pilot schemes to look at rough sleeping across the whole country simply doesn't cut it. We want action now to help those poor people that are forced to sleep on our streets and beg for the money.
Order. I think the whip should know better. Mr. Spencer, I'm sure you can relax. If not, please, we don't need any more from me. If not, leave the chamber. Jeremy Corbyn.
The point I was making, Mr. Speaker, 3 new pilot schemes for rough sleepers simply doesn't cut it. It is a disaster for those people sleeping on our streets, forced to beg for the money for a night shelter. They're looking for action now from government to give them a roof over their heads. In some parts of the country, Mr. Speaker, life expectancy is actually beginning to fall. The last Labour government lifted 1 million children out of poverty. It was an amazing achievement. Under this government, an extra 1 million children will be plunged into poverty by the end of this Parliament. 1.9 million pensioners, 1 in 6 of all pensioners, are living in poverty, the worst rate anywhere in Western Europe. So it's falling pay, slow growth and rising poverty, and this is what the Chancellor has the cheek to call a strong economy. His predecessors said they would put the burden on those with the broadest shoulders. So how's that turned out? The poorest tenth, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the poorest tenth of households will lose 10% of their income by 2022, while the richest will lose just 1%. So much for tackling burning injustices. This is a government tossing fuel on the fire. Personal debt levels are rising. 8.3 million people over-indebted. If he wants to help people out of debt, he should back Labour's policy for a real living wage of £10 an hour by 2020. Working-class young people now leaving university with £57,000 worth of debt because this government, his government, trebled tuition fees, and the new government policy is to win over young people by keeping fees at £9,250 per year. More debt for people who want to learn. But that is just one of the multitudes of injustices presiding over this government. Another is universal credit, which we called on the ministers to pause and fix. That's the view of this House. It's the verdict of those on the front line.
Mr Pincher, to shout out, keep going, he will. But you'll be going out to the chamber. Jeremy Corbyn.
I would rather people stay to listen, actually, Mr Deputy Speaker, to the reality.
Silence! That's the difference. Mr Hoare, it will be in silence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Maybe the benches opposite would like to listen to Martin's experience. A full-time worker on a minimum wage. He said, I get paid 4 weekly, meaning that my pay date is different each month. And because of under the universal credit system, he was paid twice in a month and deemed to have earned too much. His universal credit was cut off. This led me into rent arrears, and I had to use a food bank for the first time in my life. That is the humiliation that he and so many others have gone through because of the problems of universal credit. Wouldn't it have been better to pause the whole thing and look at the problems it has caused? The Chancellor's solution to a failing system causing more debt is to offer a loan. And the 6-week wait, with 20% waiting even longer, simply becomes a 5-week wait. This system has been run down by £3 billion of cuts to work allowances, the 2-child limit and the perverse and appalling rape clause, and caused evictions because housing benefit isn't paid direct to the landlord. So I say to the Chancellor again, put this system on hold so it can be fixed and keep 1 million of our children out of poverty. For years, we've had the rhetoric of, Deputy Speaker, a long-term economic plan that never meets its targets, when what all too many are experiencing is long-term economic pain. And hardest hit are disabled people. So it's disappointing the Chancellor did not back the campaign by my honourable friend, the member for Brent Central, to end period poverty. He could have done that. Well done her on the campaign. Shame on him for not supporting it. The Conservative manifesto in the last election disappeared off its website after 3 days. And now some ministers opposite have put forward some half-decent proposals conspicuously borrowed by from the Labour manifesto. Let me tell the Chancellor, Mr Speaker, as socialists we're happy to share ideas. The Community Secretary called 50 billion of borrowing to invest in house building. Presumably the Prime Minister slapped him down for wanting to bankrupt Britain. The Health Secretary said the pay cap is over, but where is the money to fund the pay rise? The Chancellor has not been clear today, not for NHS workers, our police, firefighters, teachers, teaching assistants, bin collectors, tax collectors or armed forces personnel. So will the Chancellor listen to Claire, who says her mum works for the NHS? She goes above and beyond for her patients. Why does the government think it's OK to underpay, overstress and underappreciate all those that work within our NHS? The NHS Chief Executive says The budget for the NHS next year is well short of what is currently needed. And from what the Chancellor has said today, it's still going to be well short of what is needed. He said in 2015 they would fund another 5,000 GPs. But in the last year, 1,200, we've had 1,200 fewer GPs. And we've lost community nurses and mental health nurses. The Chancellor promised 10 billion in 2015 and delivered 4.5. So if you don't mind, we'll wait for the small print on today's announcement. But even what he said certainly falls well short of the 6 billion Labour would have delivered from our June manifesto. Over 1 million of our elderly aren't receiving the care they need. Over 6 billion will have been cut from social care budgets by next March. I hope the honourable member begins to understand what it's like to wait for social care stuck in a hospital bed or other people having to give up their work to care for them. The uncaring, uncouth attitude of certain members of to be called out.
Order. Carry on.
Mr. Speaker, that is why social care budgets are so important for so many very desperate people in our country. Our schools, Mr. Deputy Speaker, will be 5% worse off by 2019, despite the Conservative manifesto promising no school would be worse off. 5,000 head teachers from 25 counties wrote to the Chancellor saying, "We are simply asking for the money that has been taken out of the system to be returned." A senior science technician wrote to me, Robert, saying, my pay has been reduced by over 30%. I've seen massive cuts at my school. Good teachers and support staff leave. That is what does for the morale of both teachers and students in school. According to this government, 5,000 head teachers are wrong, Robert is wrong, the IFS is wrong, everybody is wrong except the Chancellor. And if the Chancellor bothered to listen to what local government is saying, they have been warning that services for the most vulnerable children are under more demand than ever. Yes. More children being taken into care, more in desperate need of help and support. Yet they're labouring with a 2 billion shortfall in the cost of dealing with vulnerable children. Because local councils have lost 80%, will have lost 80% of their direct funding by 2020. And the reality of this, Mr. Speaker, across the country is women's refuges closing, youth centres closing, libraries closing, museums closing, public facilities understaffed, under-resourced and under-financed. It could be so different. But, Mr. Speaker, compassion can cost very little. Just £10 million is needed to establish the Child Funeral Fund campaigned for so brilliantly by my honourable friend, the member for Swansea East. Why couldn't the Chancellor have at least agreed to fund that? Under this government, there are also 20,000 fewer police officers and another 6,000 community support officers and 11,000 fire service staff have been cut as well. You cannot keep communities safe on the cheap. Tammy explains this. Our police presence has been taken away from her village, meaning increasing crime. As a single parent, I no longer feel safe in the village where I live, particularly at night. Mr. Speaker, 5.5 million workers earn less than the living wage, 1 million more than 5 years ago. And the Chancellor last Sunday couldn't even see 1.4 million people unemployed in this country. There is a crisis of low pay and insecure work, affecting 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men. A record 7.4 million people in working households living in poverty. If we want workers earning better pay, less dependent on in-work benefits, we need strong trade unions. We need the most effective way of boosting workers' pay. Instead, this government weakened trade unions and introduced employment tribunal fees, now scrapped thanks to the victory in the courts by Unison, a trade union representing its members. And Mr Deputy Speaker, why didn't the Chancellor take the opportunity to make 2 changes to control debt? Firstly, to cap credit card debt so that nobody pays back more than they borrowed. And secondly, to stop credit card companies increasing people's credit limit without their say-so. Debt is being racked up because the government is weak on those who exploit people, such as rail companies hiking up fares above inflation year on year, and water companies and energy suppliers. During the general election, it promised an energy cap that would benefit around 17 million families on standard variable tariffs. But every bill tells millions of families the government has broken that promise. And with $10 billion in housing benefit going into the pockets of private landlords every year, housing is a key factor in driving up the welfare bill. Not too many words from the Chancellor about the excessive levels of rent in the private rented sector. With this government delivering the worst rate of house building since the 1920s and a quarter... and a quarter of a million fewer council homes, any commitment would be welcome. But we've been here before. The government promised 200,000 starter homes 3 years ago. Not a single one has yet been built in those 3 years. We need a large-scale, publicly funded house-building programme, not this government's accounting tricks and empty promises. Yes, we back the abolition of stamp duty for first-time buyers because it was another Labour policy in our manifesto in June, not a Tory one. And this government continues preference for spin over substance. That means across this country the words Northern Powerhouse and Midlands Engine are now met with derision. Yorkshire and Humber get only 1/10 of the transport investment per head given to London. And government figures show that every region in the north of England has seen a fall in spending on services since 2012. The Midlands, East and West, is receiving less than 8% of total transport infrastructure investment, compared with 50% going to London. In the East and West Midlands, 1 in 4 workers are paid less than the living wage. So much for the Midlands Engine. Re-announced funding for the Transpennine rail route won't cut it, and today's other announcements won't redress that balance. Combined with counterproductive austerity, this lack of investment has consequences in sluggish growth and shrinking pay brackets. Public investment has virtually halved. Under this government, Britain has the lowest rate of public investment in the G7. But it's now investing in driverless cars after months of road testing backseat driving in the government. By moving from RPI to CPI indexation on business rates, the Chancellor has adopted another Labour policy. But why don't they go further and adopt Labour's entire business rates pledge, including exempting plant and machinery and annual revaluation of business rates? Nowhere has their chaos been more evident than over Brexit. Following round after round of fruitless Brexit negotiations, the Brexit Secretary has been shunted out for the Prime Minister, who has got no further. Every major business organisation has written to the government telling them to pull their finger out and get on with it. Businesses are delaying crucial investment decisions because if this government doesn't get its act together soon, they will be taking relocation decisions. Crashing out with no deal and turning Britain into a tax haven will damage people's jobs and living standards, serving only a wealthy few. It's not as if this government isn't doing its best to protect tax havens and their clients in the meantime. The Paradise Papers have again exposed how a super-rich elite is allowed to get away with dodging taxes. This government has opposed measure after measure in this House and their Tory colleagues in the European Parliament to clamp down on the tax havens that facilitate this outrageous leeching from our public purse. Non-paid tax, clever reinvestment to get away with tax, actually hits hospitals, schools, housing and hits the poorest and most needy in our society. There's nothing moral about dodging tax. There's everything immoral about evading it. Mr. Speaker, too often it feels like there is one rule for the super-rich and another for the rest of us. The horrors of Grenfell Tower were a reflection of a system that puts profits before people, that fails to listen to working-class communities. In 2013, the government received advice in a coroner's report that sprinklers should be fitted in all high-rise buildings. Today, once again, the government failed to fund the £1 billion investment needed. The Chancellor says the council should contact them. But Nottingham has, Westminster has, and they've been refused. Nothing was offered to them. We, Mr. Speaker, have the privilege to be members of Parliament in a building that is about to be retrofitted with sprinklers to protect us. The message is pretty clear. This government cares more about what happens here than happens to people living in high-rise homes. In effect, saying they matter less. Our country, Mr. Speaker, is marked by growing inequality and injustice. We were promised with lots of hype a revolutionary budget. The reality is nothing has changed. People were looking for help from this budget and they've been let down. Let down by a government that, like the economy they presided over, is weak and unstable and in need of urgent change. They call this a budget fit for the future. The reality is this is a government no longer fit for office.
Nicky Morgan!
So the Leader of the Opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, tearing into the budget, saying he's very angry with it and saying that it won't address the social problems, that people will go on being